Welcome, everybody. This is Joy Hall Bryant. Glad to have you with us today. The topic is procurement and digital accessibility. And we'll get started with that in just a moment. If you want to know more about other topics we're hosting, the best thing is to go to our calendar at dir.texas.gov. Click on the calendar link, which is at the top of every single page. You may also want to join one of our discussion lists. Jeff, do you want to mention accessibility before we go on? Or are you going to talk about it later?
I can mention it now. So DIR has a discussion list. It used to be known as PESO, and we just pretty much changed the name of it to DIR-accessibility. And you can find that on our community page. And that is a discussion list that I use to convey information that's relevant to all things accessibility, whether it could be news articles, it could be webinars that are available, outside of DIR or other places or inside. And it's a place where other people can pose questions and be able to get an answer from people that are kind of, in the know in those things to keep those dialogues going. So anybody that's involved in accessibility, I would encourage you to sign up for that.
If you go to the main page of DIR or the calendar page, bottom left corner, you'll see Stay Connected. Just click on that, you'll see the options. Many of you are interested in accessibility, so you might be interested in that list. There are others. All of the IRMs, you have a designated IT leader called an IRM if you're a state agency or state university. That's a key contact point with DIR. They belong to a separate restricted list, which is only for IRMs, but any IT person could join DIR Tech. And then DIR Train is really for the training communities. And then there are others. You can check them out at your leisure. So I'm going to turn this over to Jeff and turn my camera off, and we will get started. Just let us change out the slide deck.
Everybody see that? Okay. I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off. I'd like to start out this session with a little storytelling on an area of online recruiting. So there's an agency, fictitious agency called Agency X, and they just completed the procurement and the deployment of a new web application that was designed to streamline their recruiting of new employees, managing job candidates, etc. And there was a company called Software Company A that developed this product for them, this custom product. And both Company A and the agency did studies that talked about how they were going to gain efficiencies, cost savings, and quality of candidates, et cetera, et cetera. So they went ahead and they implemented this new application. And of course, they could reduce their HR resources that were involved in recruiting. So they rolled some of them off into some other areas of HR. And there was a programmer named Susan, top-notch programmer, and she heard about an opening at Agency X. So she went online and she tried to apply for this, for a job there to match that. So she went on and she started having trouble with the website because Susan was blind and the website was not made accessible. So she tried to find a contact information, but as we know, a lot of that stuff kind of just disappears into the ether once process has been automated. But she did manage to reach somebody a couple of days later, and then they said, well, we'll be back to take your information in a few days. So about 4 or 5 days later, somebody called her from Agency X, and they sat down with her and they said, okay, let's get your information. What was that job rec number that you were applying to? So Susan gave them the job rec number, and they said, oh, gee, we don't have that anymore. That position was just filled. So Susan was a little bit annoyed that she didn't have the opportunity to really apply for that because she felt she was pretty well qualified. And as many people with disabilities do, they have pretty active discussion forums. And there was a civil rights attorney that kind of monitors these forums, looking for things like that to see how he can help. And so he reached out to Susan, and he decided that he would try to contact Agency X to talk to them about this issue of accessibility. So he made an initial contact. They went back and forth a couple times. Over a period of a few weeks, the attorney realized that he was really just kind of getting the stiff arm, and the agency was clueless. So they filed a discrimination lawsuit under Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, I know this maybe sounds like I'm telling a story, but this is the kind of stuff that happens all the time. So let's let's think about this a little bit and say, well, if we go back and we start looking at root causes, what happened that led us up to this whole event? Well, let's look at Agency X. They had no ICT accessibility maturity within their organization. Now, when I say ICT, a lot of us in the state call that EIR. Consider those interchangeable. ICT, EIR, EIT, they're all pretty much the same. But anyway, the agency wasn't mature in accessibility. What does that mean? Well, they didn't know really anything about accessibility. The IT requester for this application didn't include any accessibility requirements, based on lack of knowledge. And there was no language in the solicitation with regard to accessibility, no evaluation, and no contract language in the contract as it went done, and no user acceptance criteria. Now, but the bottom line is there was no corporate or agency ICT accessibility policy. Now, if we go to software company A, kind of the same thing. No maturity in accessibility. They didn't know about accessibility, or it wasn't considered a priority. There was no technical knowledge or skills within the organization to build accessible products. Accessibility was not integrated into their development process or their final result. And again, no policy organization-wide on accessibility. So this is kind of a big problem. And of course, there was a lot of finger pointing, and, Agency X, when that complaint came into them, they filed a complaint against software company A. And of course, lots of people got involved and lots of lawyers, the press picked up on it. So it can be a very, very painful situation when one of these things occurs, which is pretty much avoidable. But if we look at what's going on in the industry, these kind of complaints are on the rise. They're filed as discrimination under the ADA, and last year, in 2019, maybe early 2020, Domino's website, that was sued for accessibility, their case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. So I would consider them the new poster child for accessibility. Now, the Supreme Court decided not to hear that case, and they kicked it back down into the lower courts, and it's still winding its way through. But just to give you an indication of where this stuff is going today. The lawsuits have nearly tripled, since 2013. They're continuing to rise. You see that there's a little pictogram, a little image I have on there that has a smattering of logos of different public and private sector organizations that I used to use in a bigger screen, but that's gotten so enormous that there's just no way that I could include those in any kind of a graphic that made sense. There's also been drive-by lawsuits where some of these maybe less than scrupulous attorneys have used scanning tools kind of in a random way, and then filed lawsuits or sent demand letters to private and public sector organizations about their websites, offering to help them through that, in exchange for compensation, et cetera. And there were web accessibility standards were proposed by the DOJ, but they went into the inactive state. But it should be noted that that had little impact on litigation, because when all these settlements come up or cases are won, they always land on the technical standard WCAG 2. Whatever the release is, level AA, as the technical standard for compliance. So still out there, very active, and everybody needs to pay attention to it. Now, when we talk about these kind of regulations, there's IT regulations all over the world. Many countries, most cite some kind of a technical standard. In the US, we follow the US Section 508, which is a federal procurement regulation, and the state of Texas has elected to kind of harmonize around that with a few modifications. And just as a note, 508 became effective in the first place back in January of 2000, and it was refreshed in 2018 for compliance by federal agencies. And you know, it references WCAG 2.0 as the technical standard, as we have now aligned in the state of Texas. And of course, we have our administrative code that maps not only to the technical standards in 508, we also have governance criteria that talks about things like procurement and exceptions. And I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. So we're here to talk about procurement, and I call it the procurement dependency. So the deal is that vendor-sourced IT products and services make up the majority of IT in almost any organization. Nobody's out there building their own stuff completely for their own use and running, you know, autonomously on all that stuff. Most of it is procured, and we don't see that kind of a thing going away in the foreseeable future. And so everybody in public and private sector is dependent on buying accessible products and services. And one way that when you're trying to buy these kinds of things, you are provided documentation from these different vendors. And what we're really trying to get to here is how good is that documentation? Well, for commercial off-the-shelf products, levels of accessibility are documented in what's called a voluntary product accessibility template, or VPAT. Is the blank template. Once it's completed, it turns into an ACR, or accessibility conformance report. And that goes through WCAG and a number of different other things. But the problem with those is accuracy varies just wildly from vendor to vendor and product to product. I'm going to be talking about that in a little bit. And then for development services, like when you go out to buy somebody's services to build a website or a web application, it's not commercial off the shelf, right? It's all custom. And so there are no VPATs and they don't apply. So other forms of documentation and assessment have to be used in order to try to ascertain the vendor's abilities to produce an end product that's accessible. So when we talk about bad documentation that we get from vendors in a lot of different ways, there's a lot of impacts that can cause. And when you're trying to procure products, it can cause contract delays. A lot of times those contracts could be on hold until accurate documents or requests for supplemental information are received or evaluated. The products with inaccurate documents could actually be eliminated from multi-manufacturer contracts. So, you know, this is kind of a dilemma that a lot of resellers have to deal with. A customer could choose to just cease negotiations with a vendor because they've been trying to get quality documentation. The vendor can't provide it, or vice versa. The vendor could just, you know, lift up his arms and say, well, you know, this isn't worth it. We're just not going to bid on this contract. And so those are kind of a lot of the things in the solicitation process that can occur. But once the contract is awarded, now you've got the product that is out there and it's being used, and the bottom line, the inaccurate documents are going to actually misrepresent the product. And so, and in some cases, like in the case of DIR, when folks are buying off of our contracts, I get a lot of questions about, you know, since it's in your list, is it assumed to be fully compliant? And a lot of people base their buying decisions on that. And of course, that's we don't do that. We can't possibly do that. I can talk about that in a little while. And then also, you know, once those things are deployed, there's an impact to users with disabilities, right? Either employees or members of the public. It's an outwardly facing application, and that results in discrimination complaints, like the scenario that I painted early on in the when we got started. Can invoke warranties and remedies clauses requiring the vendors to mitigate issues or customers to seek legal remedies, because in a lot of cases, they may not even be able to mitigate those issues. And ultimately could result in a contract termination. So where does accessibility apply? And I get this question a lot, and I see a lot of different responses from vendors. And I have a kind of a very simple way to think about it. And when I talk to the vendors, I try to explain that to them. And it's basically if the hardware or software included any hosted services has a user interface of any kind that a customer or a member of the public interacts with, ICT accessibility applies. So with hardware, it could be, control panels, flat screens on printers, any associated software or firmware, for setup, et cetera. Those would all be applicable. And of course, software, applications, websites, admin consoles, management consoles, diagnostics, training videos and training applications, portals, even development tools and the output that they produce. All of those would have some kind of a user interface. Now, I get a lot of responses that say, well, we're claiming a back office exemption. But a back office exemption really only applies to service personnel interaction. So if a factory trained technician comes into your machine room and he has to go in there and set up a machine in a certain way, and it's nobody from a member of the public or nobody from your from a state agency or anything like that is involved, that's the only way that I view a back office exemption to be applicable. So whenever you see that back office exemption from somebody, it can evoke some questions. So how do you make sure that you're buying products that are as accessible as can be, or at least basing your decisions on accurate documentation provided by vendors? Well, the key thought there is engage an accessibility subject matter expert throughout the procurement lifecycle, right? So in the solicitation, that person should be involved in reviewing and creating the solicitation language and whatever documents are required for vendors to respond to, communicating about accessibility requirements at pre-bid conferences or other forms of pre-solicitation or pre-bid kind of activities, and then develop an evaluation methodology, which could even include scoring metrics on how you're going to score these responses. Then once you've gotten these responses back in, you have to kind of look at these submissions in the evaluation phase. And what you really need to do is have these documents evaluated for credibility and accuracy. And in our TAC rules, we actually talk about credible evidence. So that's really what they're looking for. And then once you've looked at those initial pass of the documents, you can follow up with vendors on those responses, requesting additional information as needed, with the vendors, evaluating additional documents that they send to you. One of the things that I do when it's a development service request, I'll go out onto their website and I'll just go check their homepage with a page checker and see how accessible their homepage is. That can give you an indication of them eating their own dog food. And then what that subject matter expert will do is make recommendations on the procurement based on those findings. And then, obviously there's a whole bunch of other things that go into a procurement, and that'll be factored in whatever way, shape, or form it's determined by the procurement folks in the organization. Then in the contract language, make sure that you've got specific accessibility information in there and the requirements for the deliverables. Make sure the technical standards are in there. Making sure that, if it's a development project, make sure you've got some accessibility built into the checkpoints as things get developed. Review of test plans and the executed results. and then what the plans are for corrective actions and revenues and warranties. And when you get to the solicitation, it's important that the requirements are well defined. So you have to have that technical spec in there. And most folks will use 508 or WCAG. In some ways, it's a little bit redundant because 508 does point to WCAG, but I don't think that it's a bad thing to be a little bit redundant in this case, because you still see a lot of vendors who don't really pay attention to those requirements and submit responses anyway, and that you require accurate documents and using the forms either specified or included. So for COTS, it's accessibility conformance reports, or ACRs. For development applications, we created a form at DIR called Vendor Accessibility Development Services Information Request, or VATSR. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And also policy-driven adoption, which is something that you may or may not have heard of. And this is really how we kind of look at organizational maturity of the companies that are submitting, and using that as an additional data point to kind of check and balance the other things that have come in. And again, I just want to recap that our administrative rules require DIR and all agencies to obtain credible evidence of the vendor's capability to produce accessible EIR products and services. Such evidence may include, but not limited to, a vendor's internal accessibility policy documents, contractual warranties for accessibility testing documents, and examples of prior work results. So this is the accessibility language on this slide, and I don't expect everybody to read it, but you'll have a copy of this. And this is the language that we put into our solicitations for cooperative contracts, and also for other things that we buy directly, the DIR uses, or for enterprise kind of contracts. And again, we talk about what's needed for COTS, what's needed for non-COTS, and again, the policy-driven adoption for self-assessment. So there's usually, when there's a large procurement that has all different components, all three of those have to be submitted in return. So for VPATs, and we get a lot of questions on that, and I'm sure that a lot of the folks out there still have questions on them. What they are formal statements of compliance documenting accessibility to US Section 508 technical standards and WCAG 2. I have an X there because there's different levels of that. And from the state of Texas, we don't really care other than it's 2.0 or higher. ACRs have to be completed by the manufacturers. And the reason I say that, I think you'll see that in a minute. So the COTS products and services utilize a form that's an industry standard form that's out there at the link that is on this chart. It's by a industry organization. The instructions are included in the template, and they have to be manufacturer generated responses and product family specific. And then the way that these are really supposed to be completed is using accessibility test results performed by individuals that are trained in generally accepted accessibility test methods and tools, and supported by additional documentation on request. They really need to be accurate, and inaccurate claims can carry potential risks to both customers and manufacturers. And I think my previous slides kind of told the story on that. So let's look at the ACR. This is the VPAT template of old, right? This is the one that was called the VPAT 1.0. There's a title field in there, information. Doesn't have much in there, date, name of product, contact for more information. Even with that little bit of information that was needed, you'd be surprised how many folks left that blank. So if that's not completely filled out, the document is invalid. And there's the main sections of the criteria. In this case, they were these highlighted in blue, these 6 sections. And then supporting features was the degree of compliance. And then in the supporting, in the remarks and explanations, that's where when you put a level of support in supporting features, you're supposed to explain that in the in the field and remarks and explanations. Now, those sections 1194.21 all the way to 26, some of those will be completed depending on the type of product. You complete the functional performance criteria if none of those other ones apply, and always completed is information, documentation, and support. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is we still see these VPATs. We see them for older products where they still are in price list, but they haven't really made any changes over the last couple of years, and so therefore they haven't moved to the new VPAT template. And this is kind of the new VPAT template. Note the different amount of detail that's required in the title block, not just the product, but the version, a description, the date of the report, contact information, notes, evaluation methods used. That's a very important field that was added, and you can tell a lot from that. And then in some ways very similar, you have the criteria, the performance level, and the remarks, but what you can see here is all the criteria in the left-hand column is all from the WCAG 2.0. That's level A, and it goes down into double A. But in the conformance level, there are different kinds of IT. So if it's a web application, you would be completing that. If it's a software application, you would be completing that field. Authoring tools, so it's going to be specific depending on what kind of a product that they're reporting on. And then whatever they have in there for the conformance level, like for web, if it says partially supports, then you would need to have supporting information in the remarks and the explanations. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of the contrast between those two. I don't really have time to go in depth into this, into how to complete a VPAT, but there's some things online that are available that will help you with that. Now, when you're analyzing VPATs and ACRs, I'm not sure whether you got the gist of that by the manner of my discussion, but be skeptical. They can contain false, inaccurate, or misleading information, and that's why it's important to engage an accessibility SME or other trained accessibility professional to analyze those. So this is just kind of by all means not meant to be fully inclusive, but when you're thinking about looking at these VPATs, these are some of the red flags that I generally see that make the antenna go up on the back of my head. When a vendor comes back and asks, what's a VPAT? That can be a sign that there's going to be some issues. Sometimes you won't get a VPAT for a product when you know that that having a VPAT is applicable because it's got user interfaces. I see a lot of these VPATs coming in with there's no VPAT, but some vendor will issue some flowery global non-specific. Oh, we want to comply and we make every effort. Blah blah blah. That's not a VPAT. Okay, that's just it's not valid. And then I've seen a single VPAT representing a mixed set of product types and vendor offerings. So I'm sorry, but a vendor can't put their whole portfolio under one VPAT, if their portfolio consists of different kinds of products like laptops and printers and storage devices and mainframe. All of those kind of families of products are going to need separate VPATs. And then blank fields in the title block, missing the product name or the version. A blank or irrelevant response to evaluation methods used. You want to see something in there that says we use a combination of automated accessibility testing and testing with assistive technologies and code inspection and blah blah blah. One of the ones that kind of raises a red flag to me is they say based on general product knowledge, and so you're pretty much assured if they're just basing it on general product knowledge that they're not going to be able to find everything, and there's going to be some surprises at the end. So you have to be really careful about that. ACRs dated back multiple years using the old VPAT template but newer products exist or are quoted, and you know that to be true because they're in the price list. Incomplete sections or the use of not applicable in areas of a VPAT that you know are to be applicable. VPATs created by the reseller and not the offering manufacturer. A lot of times, like if you have 3 or 4 manufacturer brands in there and they all look very, very similar, same format, same responses, it's a good indication that maybe the reseller actually put those together, and that's going to result in misrepresenting the product, usually in a big way. No information in the remarks columns at all that describe the supporting features. Little or no remarks when partially supports is claimed. Supports or non-A for all responses in the supporting features column. So that's just kind of a good idea of a lot of these red flags on VPATs. So when these documents are questionable, follow up with questions. And these are perfectly legitimate to ask a vendor. What tools and methods were used to complete this ACR? If you're not satisfied with what they put in the evaluation methods and the responses don't look credible. What client platforms, operating systems, mobile browsers, assistive technologies, and versions were used as test environments? Can your company provide a copy of the test plan for the product? Can they provide results of the accessibility testing? What issues were found, and are there corrective actions in place to resolve them, or in a subsequent release, and when will that be? Now, if a vendor with a questionable ACR cannot or will not provide the supplemental information, you have to assume that the product is non-compliant with the technical standards, and that you need to look at that by performing a risk assessment as part of the decision process. One thing I want to just emphasize with everybody is there's probably a couple of handfuls of products in the whole world that are fully compliant or very, very close to being fully compliant. And so we know that almost everything is not. But what we do expect is the documents to be accurate so people can base the decisions on the levels of accessibility that are there and ascertain how much risk they're going to have if they go ahead and proceed with the procurement. And then TAC rules require agencies to file an exception for not fully compliant ICT, and hopefully we'll get to that at the end. I've got one slide on that. Now, I talked a little bit about development services. They don't have a VPAT, so how do we figure out, if a vendor's capable? So for solicitations, you define the standard that you want the deliverables to meet. You require credible evidence of their ability to produce accessible deliverables. And we've got these 2 forms that we use, the VATSR form that we developed at DIR, and then policy-driven adoption for accessibility, which we use. It's being used by some other states. And even the General Services Administration lists this as an additional resource. And then you inform the vendor that additional documents may also be requested based on the responses to the initial submissions, and that you're going to need accessibility test results prior to final deliverable acceptance. And if the vendor comes in and just says that they're going to do everything and they're just going to test at the end for accessibility, but nothing has really been integrated into the earlier phases of development, it's a sure bet that there's going to be problems that may or may not be fixable. So you need to really be careful about that. And then I mentioned this earlier, does the vendor eat his own dog food? Is its own public website accessible? I've seen a lot of surprised looks on vendors' faces when you tell them you've been out to their website and it's not accessible when they're trying to show how accessible they can build a product. So this is the VATSR form. I realize it's a little small on this slide, but it's only 6 questions and they're open-ended, and they address different areas of accessibility that we think are help them, believe that they're capable. The first one relates to their policy and culture. Do you have accessibility integrated into your key business processes, et cetera. Describe the skills and training that you provide or that you obtain for your people that are developing this stuff. What kind of development tools and test environments do you use? Do you have a corrective actions process for accessibility? Do you have alternate means of access or workarounds when things are deemed not accessible so that people can still, mostly use the application? And this is the one that is really valuable. Put some links in here to prior examples of your work of accessible websites. So these questions are pretty open-ended. They need to be evaluated by, again, somebody who understands accessibility, but they can be very telling. And then once you get the responses to that initial form, you can start asking questions about all that, similarly to we do, like I showed you on ACR results. So for language in services procurements, you need to be pretty specific in contract language. You need to have formal checkpoints throughout the development process, so you have to have some language about accessibility and planning in the design, development, test, et cetera. And then you as the customer need to have approval and reviewing authority for the plans and tools used for testing so that you know you're going to get a correct outcome. And language in there on how test results are going to be provided and when, what the corrective actions process is and how that's defined in the life cycle when things are discovered either pre-production or post-production. Specific language related to remedies and warranties. If it's not, if you don't feel like it's well covered in the overall remedies and warranties, and some final acceptance criteria that you can establish. Now, some of this responsibility belongs to project managers, and so I've got a list of PM questions that I'm kind of got showing here that need to be considered, and that make sure that everything is in place, especially on some of these larger projects or MERPs, that are required to make sure that accessibility is kind of fully integrated. So, is the language in the procurement documents, and then over on the right side, we talk a little bit about what is needed in each of those, making sure that you've got somebody from accessibility engaged, has criteria been established in all phases of the project, are the resources in place, have the resources been trained, are the platforms enabled to produce accessible output. Just make sure that you've got all that stuff in place. And this really applies whether you're outsourcing a development program or whether you're doing it internally. And then, has the ICT been tested at unit levels during development and throughout UAT using automated and manual test tools and methods. So when we talk about evaluation and validation of a product, it used to be, and still is in a lot of places, where agencies and as on the federal level, state levels, they have test organizations, and when they get a product from a result of a procurement contract, the vendor throws it over the wall, and then the agency or the company goes out and they start testing this thing to make sure that it meets the accessibility requirements. Well, I kind of look at that with a car analogy. If you were going to buy a car and you were out there shopping for the safest car, you do all your research, you select a car, you're not going to bring it home, you're not going to crash it into a wall to see if it made the safety, complied with the safety standards. Of course you're not. And so that's the same way that we need to treat vendor-sourced IT. The burden of proof belongs to the vendor and not the customer. They need to be producing credible evidence all along. They need to have contractual language, in the agreement and a final deliverables statement of compliance. So they're the ones who need to be providing the testing, end-to-end testing, sharing the results, showing what the corrective actions are to remediate errors. Now, that doesn't mean that you as the customer should do nothing and just take everything at face value, but you don't have to do full-blown testing of anything that you buy. You can look at their test results. You have your accessibility professionals look over the test results, see where the issues are, and then you can actually go in with somebody and do some sniff testing just to validate that the documents they sent you are, in fact, credible or, to the best of their knowledge, accurate. And then once you get that final deliverable is ready, you might consider a letter from the vendor for go live that it's been developed and tested in accordance with accessibility practices. Results are accurate in the testing, and the deliverable complies with accessibility standards, and then have some notes in there where, in fact, it's documented that it doesn't, that there are corrective action plans in place, and that all needs to, as set forth if you have the right language in the contract or the SOW. Now, the last thing I want to talk about briefly is the policy-driven adoption for accessibility. And this talks about the maturity of an organization's policy, which kind of can tell you how well they can produce accessible offerings. And it's the integration of governance as opposed to technical criteria into an organization that helps enable them to drive themselves to improve accessibility over time. It can be applied to any public or private sector organization, but it's really handy to use in procurement because it helps drive vendor awareness and, helping them progress towards achieving more accessible offerings in the long term. So again, I don't know why, just coincidentally, with the number 6 criteria, but the criteria are all centered around, policy creation. Does this company have and are they implementing a policy? Organization, do they have somebody with accessibility stamped on their forehead and, have pieces and parts in place throughout the organization to make sure that they can implement accessibility consistently, which includes integration into accessibility criteria, into all the phases, providing processes for addressing inaccessible ICT, making sure that they have skills in place, and then making sure that they have information that they can share with customers on their policy, their plans, and that can even include VPATs or VATSers, making sure that that is all accurate and they have the ability to share it. So there's 3 phases in the maturity model: launch, integrate, and optimize. And you see a little bar chart down on the bottom. There's a questionnaire that we send out to vendors, and they're required to complete that. As they complete that it's really an Excel spreadsheet at this point. It just populates this little bar chart and it shows them where they are in their journey towards optimized accessibility. And on this slide, the full template is over there to the right next to the bar. You can see a little bit more about the bar. I think there's 61 questions, 61 total points, and then we convert that into a percentage, of course. And it can be used by private and public organizations to even guide their own journeys in accessibility. But like I say, we use it as a procurement tool. It helps assess the vendor's ability to produce offerings, gauge confidence in their other documentation, and we can track vendor progress. So if they're submitting to bids, multiple times a year or every 2 years, and they complete this form, we would expect to see higher levels of maturity. And if they stay flat at 0 and say, yeah, we're not interested in the policy, yeah, we're not, at some point, we may decide not to do business with them anymore because it carries with it too much risk. And then this is just a quick scoring example. If you had all 3 components in there where you have COTS, development services, and PDAA, excuse me. So the VPAT scoring, we score from 0 to 3, and 0 means that VPAT was required, but they didn't provide one, all the way to credible, accessible documentation for all or most of the products. So those get us, each one of those gets assigned a point value, to normalize it into a percentage. VPAT scores from 0 to 100, and so that's just, it is what it is. And then the development services, that is a either SAT or unsat, and based on how they completed that, developed the VASR form. So then you take that, now that you've assigned all these, you've got percentages in there, and let's say that this scoring is up to 15% of the procurement. So when you do if you look across here, you've got a satisfactory dev services is 100 points. The VPAT rating is 60 points. The VPAT score is 97. So you get an accessibility score of 85.67%, which is a pretty high rating. And then if that counts as 15% of the procurement, then you take 15% of that, and you come up with the final score of 12.85 or somewhere in there. So that's kind of just one example of how you might score that. And you can also see a lot of the comments in there as well. So it's just one methodology that we've used on some enterprise contracts. Then, of course, state agencies and state-funded IHEs are required to file exceptions when things aren't fully compliant. And really what this has to be signed by the head of your agency. It's a risk acceptance. So the head of your agency is accepting the risk of a non-compliant product. And this should really be made before the contract award is done, because if you award the contract and then you stick it in front of the nose of your ED or the president or chancellor, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. It's already done. So it becomes a rubber stamp. And guess what? Your senior manager has accepted the risk, whether he meant to or wanted to or not. So be aware of that. It should be signed before the contract is awarded. It does not eliminate the risk associated with non-accessible IT. I get that all the time. It just allows you to be in compliance with the rules, but the ADA trumps that, so be aware of that. It doesn't eliminate the responsibility to provide an accessible solution, and there should be good justification in the form, and should also include a plan for compliance. Maybe that's an 800 number for people that can't access it, a desk side assist, let's say, if it's an internal thing by a manager. And as I said, it should be signed by the head of the organization. So let me just wrap up. I've been talking nonstop here. I'm going to open it up for questions in a second. Procuring accessible IT can be challenging. Know what to ask for in solicitations, what specs, what forms to use, know how to analyze vendor responses, examine for credible evidence and red flags, request additional information as deemed appropriate, test tools, test plans, results, talked about that, use solid contract language, specifications, checkpoints, et cetera, and even a compliance statement at the end if it's a development contract. Ensure accessibility has been performed by vendor prior to accepting final deliverables, and that's really important for dev services. Engage accessibility professionals throughout the process, and file exceptions for inaccessible IT and include justification and future compliance plans. So the last page here is just reference information. If you look at the top one there, I want to go ahead and just mention, if you don't know, DIR has a learning management system that's available to any state employee or state-funded employee of a higher ed, which is a learning management system, and it deals with every aspect of accessibility. You can go in there and drill in and get the answer to one thing and with one particular course or a subject, or you can go in there and go from one to N and complete a whole course and curriculum. Very valuable. I've talked about that a number of times. We have close to 1,000 people enrolled. We've had close to 1,000 course completions. I would urge everybody in every organization under DIR's purview to take advantage of this. And then I've just got a few other ones here. And then the policy-driven adoption. And there's one in there, strategic organization, strategic IT accessibility. That's a book that I wrote, and I think that's, not trying to plug or sell books here, but I think it's a very valuable book, and it's been well received throughout the industry over the last 10 years. I just did the second edition earlier this year. Okay, well, that's all I have. I know that was a mouthful, so I hope nobody was trying to take notes. You'll have the slides, and I will turn it back over to Joy.
Great. And if you want to turn your camera back on while we do Q&A. So we've got about 6 minutes for questions. Remember, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A pane. It'll get lost in the chat window. So first one, in the solicitation phase, does DIR have specific approved language that should be included in contracts?
We have that page that I showed you for in solicitations. That's the language that is in our standard template. So with regard to contracts, yes, we do have some standard language. I didn't share that. It may vary a little bit from depending on what kind of contract it is. But you can go out and look at any one of our contracts by vendor name or by vendor topic. Every contract, DIR has a page out there for every vendor that we have a contract with, and the full contract is out there. You can review those at your discretion.
And is that an area where the DIR accessibility list that peers could share with each other on that type of thing?
We do not, in terms of the results, in terms of the VPATs and the documents that we get, we don't really share that because the problem is that stuff is really only good on the day that it's done. And so what we always recommend is that when you're getting ready to buy a product or a service, that you go directly to the vendor and ask them for the most recent VPAT. With regard to the VATSR form, quite honestly, if they don't, if their responses to that are unsatisfactory and we've had a discussion with them that we're not satisfied with, typically for development services, we will not put them on the DR list for contracts.
Okay. So this one is, my organization is currently working on updating our VPAT. My question is, what are some generally accepted accessibility test methods or evaluation methods?
Well, you know, the most important thing is that you need to do a combination of automated and manual inspection methods. And an automated method for like a website, for example, would be you could check page by page using a page checker. You can use scanning tools that'll actually spider down through a whole website. Applications are a little different because you have to rely on probably page checkers for that. But then making sure that you're testing manually with a screen reader or other assistive technology. There's other visual inspections that you use. There's a lot of information on that reference page. You can go to the W3C page. It'll give you some guidance on how to test for accessibility. Somebody who's qualified to do it, it takes a long time to use a screen reader, so it can't be just anybody who just gets on with a screen reader to try to test.
Can you suggest some tools that can be used to check the accessibility of a vendor's web page?
Well, I don't want to, I'm not sure that I can really promote anybody's products, but there are checking tools that are out there. If you do a search on accessibility testing tools or automated tools, there's a nonprofit called WebAIM. It's run by a guy named Jared Smith. They do have a tool out there that I use. It's a free tool. You can plug it right into your browser, called Wave, and it's a very good page checking tool, very easy to use. But there are a number of them that are all good. They're all, they're kind of all about the same.
Okay. Do you ever use weighting on accessibility requirements? Example, making one requirement worth more than another.
Well, if you mean requirements in terms of success criteria in the technical standard, no. And we've gone back and forth in my old job at IBM and here. If you try to do that, some group of people with disabilities is going to get the short end of the stick. And so I really don't think that that's a useful exercise. You know, you want to try to comply as much as possible with all.
We only have about 1 more minute, so we're going to need to wrap up. What should people do if they have additional questions?
Well, if they have additional questions, our website is a good source of information, or talk to your accessibility coordinator. Every agency is required by rule to have one, and hopefully they can provide some information for you. If they can't, or you can't find them, then feel free to reach out to me directly. My email address is on the first slide.
Okay, I think that's going to be all the questions that we have time for right now. We are approaching 3:30. Jeff, thank you for sharing this. We really do appreciate it.
You're
So
welcome.
everybody is going to get a copy of the presentation, the CPE form. Jeff, let's include information on that Accessibility University and anything else Jeff thinks of that might be valuable to you.
Yeah, there's on the Access U, there's a link in there for that.
Perfect, perfect. Well, we appreciate it, and DIR staff who were helping me behind the scenes. I think all we have left is Tracy, but thank you. We appreciate that help too. So I think this is a wrap. Everybody have a nice afternoon.